It's my pleasure to introduce Nelli, who I've known for 6 or 7 years now. We worked together on the Logistical Worlds project, as I did with many of the people in this room, but in another setting, which is Athens, around the Costco-run concession in the port of Piraeus, so run by a Chinese state enterprise. I'm really looking forward to Nelli's talk because since I completed research there, I think in 2014, many things have happened in and around Piraeus, but I'll leave you to Nelli, who will speak for around half an hour, and then we'll move to a discussion.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me here. It's the first time I've been to India, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I mean, I have to say that I did that research with Pavlos Hadjopoulos, who is not able to travel, so I'm the one always presenting this research, but actually it's the work of two people. So I will start with some information about the Costco concession, because I think some of you have already heard it, but maybe for some of you it's still a new area. So our research in the port of Piraeus started in 2013, and this was a transitional period when the container port was divided into two parts. One part was run by Costco after a 2009 concession agreement, which was signed between the Greek government and Costco Pacific. And this part of the port had one pier initially, and Costco Pacific constructed a second pier. And the other part of the port was operated by Piraeus by OLP, which was a company, a CA company that was still previously a state-run company that was turned into a CA company, but operated under the same labor conditions as the public sector. So, following this concession, the 2009 concession, the port was transformed radically, not only in terms of a Chinese company coming into the port, but also in terms of new machines, new software, new infrastructure, a new entrepreneurial culture, and new languages, new professionals that came into the port and transform it in material ways, but also in ways that change the anticipations and desires about the future of the port. So this was the time when we started the research. Now, since then, there have been a lot of changes. In 2006, in February 2016, Costco Group Limited was declared the preferred investor. Actually, Costco Pacific Limited was the only bidder for the acquisition of 67% of the shares of Piraeus Port Authority, which was OLP. So this meant that a prolonged period of uncertainty, a period of striking against the Costco concession ended. And it's interesting to know that actually this ending, this conclusion of the concession took place under the coalition government of the left-wing party Syriza and the right-wing nationalist party ANEL, which initially was against the privatization of the port. This is how we call it in Greece, privatization of the port. And so the official privatization of the port was completed in August 2016. Now, this second phase of the agreement is quite interesting because the Costco Group has been granted the management of all port services, and this includes both container terminals. You can see it here. I don't know if you can, maybe it's it's not very clear, but I will run through it. So in the blue, in the center, you can see the container terminals, the 3 container terminals. And COSCO, initially the container terminal 1, let me show you here. Container terminal 1, this one, belonged to OLP. Now, COSCO acquired also container terminal 1, which was important, but also it acquired the neighboring dock repair industry, which is on the left with the blue area, and also the cruise port, the property owned by OLP in the surrounding area. So there is a lot of land and a lot of buildings that belong to OLP, which also came into the possession of the management of COSCO, and prolonged the COSCO concession until 2052. Now, this is an important development for several reasons, which I will try to explain in my presentation. But as you can see here, this is an infrastructural investment that actually was not limited to a specific sector. Now it includes all different sectors of the port. So what does this mean for labor in the port? Now, although workers in the OLP sector of the port face considerable reductions because of the economic crisis and the austerity measures that started since 2009, they continue to enjoy relatively privileged labor conditions. So they had contracts, they have well-paid salaries, they were paid overtime. Their jobs were recognized as hard labor, which in Greece, this has a lot of benefits for, they had full social security rights, and the right to unionize and strike. Now, labor issues were the fruit of decades of struggles in the port. And the final phase of the concession granted even more labor rights to these workers who were in the OLP part of the port. So basically, when the strike started, the Syriza government negotiated with the labor union, and in order to stop the strikes and to proceed with the final phase of the concession. And this meant extra bonuses for the OLP workers, 13 wages, which is an extra wage for during the year, and benefits like they get like benefits for children's camps and vacations. So they have all different kinds of privileges that are not common, not even in the public sector in Greece. But this was what was given to the labor unions in order to stop the strikes and allow for the 2016 extension of the concession to the whole port. Now, this gave, moreover, the government gave the opportunity to those workers who wished to move, to be transferred to the public sector. So outside the port, because the port is no longer, there's no public sector. So basically, the unions managed to secure very privileged rights for themselves. And this was part of what I call a very masculinist tradition. Okay, the struggles that took place in the port were struggles where Greek males were able to employ tactics of controlling the limit between normal and working hours. There were very few women in the container port, usually, and those that exist in the port worked usually in the cruise sector where there is no overtime, so they couldn't increase their benefits, and in administrative services. There are even fewer migrants in the board because, and they are exclusively employed in the cleaning sector of the board. So this kind, both making larger profits for oneself by presupposes a masculine subject in the sense that it is a subject that is devoid of domestic and care responsibilities. It is someone who can work more in order to gain more. But also, it was a subject that was equipped with national citizenship and labor rights guaranteed by a sovereign state. Now, this is a moment when Greece enters into the sovereign debt crisis, during which even the sovereignty of the state, its ability to hire and fire employees, is being questioned. So, labor union tactics up to 2016 demanded, and in most cases were successful, in making demands to the state through which they were able to secure public sector conditions. On the contrary, the new employees in the port, which were established after the arrival of COSCO, were involved in a very different, very complex web of contracting and subcontracting, with the exception of these few full-time employees. Most people in the port work in precarious conditions. They are informed about the hours that they are going to work each week, and these might change according to logistical operations and calculation. And these principles were actually inscribed into the concession, the 2016 concession, in order to make sure that new recruits in the port will not really be able to unionize and employ these same tactics that were used in the past in order to secure stable labor conditions. So their work, even in the container terminals, work is not considered as hard labor, and they are not included in collective agreements, which is a big issue. So at the moment, there is a labor union which started in 2000 in the COSCO. The new recruits have formed a labor union, which is actually which had its first strike in 2014, but their actions are quite complicated because they do not address the sovereign state only. They have to address these different levels of contracting and subcontracting, which means that labor union tactics are much more complicated, and they involve much greater risks for workers who are mostly with short-term contracts that are renewed every 6 months, so they are very easily dismissed from their work. And this has created a sort of division also with the OLP labor unions, because they enjoy all these privileges that I described before. So despite of working for the same employer, the two regimes of labor are present and still active in the port. And this is inscribed, these labor conditions are inscribed in the concession agreement that was signed in 2016. And this creates problems because, for example, there was a strike announced this February by the labor union of OLP workers, and it was judged as illegal by the court, so they had to stop it on grounds of violating the concession. So there are issues like that, and because they are not in the collective labor agreements, they have serious issues in actually addressing the problems that were very different for the previous for the labor unions that were in OLP. So I mean, we have the creation of this system, and the forms of precarity that emerge in the port are related to logistics and technologies that are working in the port and are changing the port. So precarity in this logistical context is not so much related to the precarity that a lot of the literature talks about in the creative industries, for example. So workers in the port have fixed and designated work time spaces. So they have to work in a specific time, and they don't have control over the time they work, which is something very different from the literature on precarity. And their work is much more like the work of what we found in what we have in Greece, the work of cleaners working in subcontracting, or the work of waiters, or the work of people working in the NGO sector. And I'm mentioning these examples because these were the examples of sectors in which the greatest labor structures have taken place during the course of the crisis in Greece. And these are sectors in which first-based labor unions, not the big ones, like labor unions that were outside the collective agreements, were able to demand and enact actually rights that were not previously there. And it is in these sectors, especially in the cleaning sector, that we saw a challenging of the male-dominated type of labor union work that we saw in the past. So we believe that the conditions for a different kind of activism and labor unionism are there in the port, and this is not necessarily related with the fact that the Chinese have entered the port, but it's mostly related because of the organization of production in the port. And at least in the container terminals that we studied during our research, we concluded that the port rests no longer on human labor utilizing machines to perform tasks, but mostly on humans and machines working together. So with the exception of a few professions, nothing in the port actually happens without the use of machines anymore. So all activities, including loading, unloading, stacking, mobility between different piers, everything is automated. And this is organized by terminal operating systems, which are also controlling the labor and planning labor relations in the port. So I won't go into that because you can read more in the paper that we published as part of the book that came out of this project. But this kind of analysis led us to think about notions of machinic assemblage or by Deleuze and Guattari, but also to go back to gender theory and Haraway's notions of the cyborg. And we started reading again Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, not in the way that it is commonly read as, you know, some kind of genderless subject which navigates easily through seamless spaces of the internet. But rather, we focused on those moments in the Cyborg Manifesto when she actually talked about labor relations. And there are these, if you read it, it's a very small text. There are these references to how masculine privilege, labor masculine privilege, is being challenged by these new forms of cyborg subjectivities that emerge. And for us, this was something that we encountered in the port, even though most of the new workers in the port are still male, and they're mostly young male-educated people. So this is it is in this sense that we challenge the feminized and ethnicized conceptions of labor that prevailed in the board, and it is in that sense that we are trying to understand this kind of division that continues despite the fact that COSCO has taken the entire port, has taken over the entire port. So this kind of understanding has led us to the notion that the port has been colonized, but not by the Chinese, but it has been colonized by these new forms of machining operations. So in return, we went back to the ways in which the concession was discussed and debated. What was the dominant discourse of the concession in the port? And on the one hand, and this is very much tied up to what you were discussing on the panel this morning, we had these futuristic scenarios of economic efficiency and, how new technologies will create a highly trained personnel, how new research will come into the port, how new infrastructures and superstructures would transform Piraeus into the largest port in the Eastern Mediterranean. And these discussions took place while Greece was going into a deep recession and a deep dependency because of rising debt. So Chinese investments were seen as a way out of to use this term, the professionalization of Greece, okay? And Ranabir has written a book about how the Greek crisis is has typical characteristics of a post-colonial crisis, debt crisis. So this kind of Chinese investment was considered to be something that will take us out of the crisis, on the one hand. On the other hand, left-wing political parties and labor unions, including Syriza and local activists, mostly adopted a signification thesis. That's why I wanted to show you this. This is from the board, a picture we took from the board, which was, the concession according to this thesis was portrayed as a step backwards, and we have these references in the left-wing press to were compared to the Roman galleons and indentured laborers in medieval Asia. So there was all this, in the left, there was all this kind of speculation about Chinese colonialism taking over Greece. Now, what happened in 2016 was that in 2015, when Syriza was elected, was that immediately, almost few months after the election, the Syriza government declared that this binary between, you know, the neoliberal seamless space and the Chinese imperialism thesis did no longer exist. And actually, Tsipras made this statement that the Chinese people gave a fight against colonialism. Today, the Greek people give a fight for their national sovereignty. So this statement is quite interesting rhetorically because it attempted to challenge the conventional left-wing fears about the Chinese invasion, the Chinese imperialism, and attached it to global struggles against neocolonialism. And I mean, this might sound new, but actually there is a tradition of this kind of third world alliance between Greece and other countries of the so-called third world, which was mostly supported by the socialist government. So, for example, the Maoists in Greece mostly ended up with the Socialist Party. And Papandreou, who was the leader at the time, I mean, when the Papandreou government was elected in the 1980s, the first person that was invited in Greece was Yasser Arafat. And this was a gesture, you know, that Greece is an ally of the third world, and not really. And this was a time when the Socialist Party were against the EU, against NATO, etc. So with this gesture, somehow Tsipras tried to sort of attach himself to this tradition, which was not the tradition of the left so much as it was the tradition of the Socialist Party. And he intended to make a statement that Greece was able to stand against Europe with the support of the Chinese. So I think this theme is quite interesting because it's not unique to the Greek case. And I was looking at this project in, this is an art project which is called Sign Africa. I'm sure you know it. It's quite interesting. And it's interesting to see how Chinese investment, Chinese infrastructure can also be interpreted as an alternative way out of the Western framework. So given Greece's post-colonial debt situation that Ranabir has described, this all made sense. And this is, for example, a photo from one of the artists in this exhibition who explores the relationship between China and Africa. His name is Magari. And his argument is that contrary to sensationalist new media about how specific and how unique Chinese investment is, actually there's no reason why we should think it is like that. And he focuses on the ways in which Chinese investment can generate futuristic scenarios. We tend to think of the future and modernity as being Western, whereas this is a case when actually this kind of notion of the future as being Eastern is introduced. And there's this picture which I really like, which is a pair of kids looking at Chinese-made television with Chinese furniture. Everything is Chinese. It's inside, you know, challenging the notion that Africans are always outside. And this kind of Chinese futuristic utopia is something that you can find in these settings. And going back to our own research, this is something we also encountered when we did our research on the hills overlooking the container ports. And this is a picture from above, and you can see on the right there's this this church that they started building before the crisis, and it's still in this state because there were no funds to continue with this picture. Now, this was an area that was really poor, one of the poorest areas in Europe according to a statistical survey, and the unemployment was really high because most of these people worked in the ship repair industry, which is now taken over by Costco. So when we interviewed those people, we sort of saw this kind of futuristic scenarios being rehearsed. And the idea that, you know, for example, they described us how the cranes arrived in the port and by sea, and how they were moved, how they moved, because these people were actually could watch from above all the development of the port. So they were so impressed by this kind of development, and they felt that they would be drawn into this kind of development, and they had all these notions that the idea that a shopping center would be created down there by their neighborhood. I mean, to give you a better understanding of this neighborhood, these houses were mostly built without licenses. Like, people just went there and built their houses, and they started as very small, jerry-built houses, and then gradually more money came in, and they were able to develop more. So this is a kind of, so here there is another example. This is the church I was talking about, which is still not made. And this is the image that you can see from these hills. At the time, in this church, the church was giving food to the people who were living there because there were no jobs, they had no food, but still there was this anticipation about this Chinese future. Oh my God, okay. Okay, so I think that to go back to these futuristic scenarios, the concept of the gateway to Europe that was used to describe, it was the blueprint, let's say the gateway to Europe was the blueprint of the Chinese investment can be read in a different way. On the one hand, it refers obviously to the strategic positioning of Greece, okay, and this is the way most Chinese officials use it. But at the same time, the conditions of the challenge of sovereignty in Greece and the restructuring of labor relations in Greece made it a very created a very fertile ground for the development of precarious labor relations. So it was this combination, let's say, of the strategic position, which the blueprint states, and the ability to work with new forms of precarity that make these kinds of relations possible. And we have these futuristic, deterritorialized visions of the future that, on the one hand, you know, they might not correspond to reality as it was discussed here, but at the same time, you know, they are quite influential in terms of how labor is understood and how subjectivities are formed in the port and in the surrounding area. So I don't think we should sort of dismiss of this kind of futuristic scenario. On the other hand, we have to be aware of how they work. So there was a lot of development in the port. I mean, we have a new freight center, new piers in the cruise sector. We have ongoing gentrification of the whole of the Piraeus area, and development of the ship repair industry that was dead, basically. So we have this development. But what is interesting in that sense, it is that contrary to the fears that the advancement of technology will reduce human labor in the port, which was something which was part of the scientification theory, what actually happened in Piraeus is that logistics multiply precarious jobs across sectors. So new infrastructures did not produce the displacement that we saw in several cases in India, but actually it's like there is a spillover of precarity, and there is somehow COSCO absorbs all kinds of different sectors into the same precarious conditions. And this is, I would like to end. So, yes, okay, I have to pass. So I would like to end with a quote from the Transnational Social Strike, which was published in fall, and it's about logistics. And I think this is quite interesting in terms of what we were discussing this morning, but also in terms of Piraeus, that you have this imaginary of efficiency, smoothness, and technological necessity connected to the so-called logistics revolution, which is only part of the story. To struggle in and against this world implies the task of unveiling the conditions laying behind this supposedly technical, logistical transformation, bringing to light what logistics systematically makes invisible. As an overall transformation of the command over labor and life, logistics is the other phase of precarity, a condition that has become general, but that logistics itself contributes to hide. And I would like to end with this. It's a reminder of our friend Giorgio, who has influenced a lot of, Giorgio Gappi, who has influenced a lot of our work, and his work in the Transnational Social Strike is quite interesting, and I think it will be interesting for all of you to follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Nelly, for that wonderful summary and tour of the events and complexities surrounding the port and Piraeus, particularly those that have unfolded in the past couple of years. I think the quote that's up on the screen there is quite resonant in terms of many of our discussions across the conference. So let's open up the floor for questions and interventions. We have half an hour.
By appreciating Nelli's lecture, apart from the fact that it brought out so many new things, but she also, I think, brought out something that I wanted to suggest in my inaugural remarks, that infrastructure has enormous productive capacity. And the whole idea that infrastructure destroys, takes away labor, everything, And I said that one of the things which labor struggle and other struggles would have to keep in mind is not to take infrastructure as a dead end, as if the world is ending there and it is the catastrophe, etc. And she has brought out, so my first thing is that my appreciation for this. Now, I have one inquiry, and Nelli enlightened me on that, which is that as you mention the different kinds of labor that is being created. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, it brings in a paradoxical situation in the sense that at one level, there is this new entity Costco, so a new company which takes over the entire range of products, etc. But at the same time, it does not produce the generality of labor, which, let us say, the earlier assembly line, typically as you spoke of the machine, that a machinic thing in the form of a factory would produce. On the other hand, you have here a picture that you show, and if I am right in understanding, it in fact speaks of greater fragmentation in terms of understanding, in terms of concepts, in terms of labor as a conceived and a perceived category. Now, my question would be in that background, if you take into account, and I go back to history because that's the only resource that we have to pose questions for future, which is that when I was doing my work on the railway strike in India, and if I have a copy, I shall gift it to you. I want to gift it. It's a dear book to me. I saw that from 1968-69, craft unions became enormously important. Now, if you read generally the history of strikes, craft union is always placed as an antediluvian thing. It's an old thing, and with labor becoming generalized, the craft unions actually pass into more general unions. But on the other hand, Indian railway strike showed that from 1970 to 73, craft unions became enormously active. The most active was the locomen's union. And the craft unions actually became the catalyst for the general railway strike. Now my question is, therefore, that in the kind of labor unrest that you also portray and you also suggest that it's not over, do you think that this kind of segmentation and the absence of a generality is a kind of a passing phase, or it's only the kind of a stepping stone towards the emergence of a new generality in port labor? Because port labor, you have suggested, port labor usually is a story of very general labor struggle. And nobody looks into port labor as a combination or a very kind of uneasy assemblage of different kinds of craft unions and other kinds of labor. So what would be your, ideas on that?
You refer to deterritorialized reality. And this phrase made me think about the report of the World Economic Forum, 632 pages long report titled Global Redesign Initiative, wherein it argues that, its submission, its proposition is that nation states, territories of states nation states are residues of medieval times. And they are suggesting that they are no more relevant in the new global economy. So when you use that phrase, I was just reminded of that. Are some international financial institutions working to ensure that nation states, the Westphalian nation states, become irrelevant in future? Thank you.
Of segmentation and generalization of labor, the generality of labor. I think, yes, it's a difficult question because I think it has to do with the way in which labor is perceived and the way in which labor is practiced by different not necessarily generation, but by different workers. So the situation right now, not only in the port of Piraeus, but in general in Greece, is that there has been a failure to acknowledge how important it is to align with precarious workers. There has been a sort of very selfish conception of labor unionism that focused on securing labor rights for our own. Okay, and this has created this segmentation. On the contrary, we have examples in the first base labor unions, yeah, that's why I mentioned the cleaners, where the Greek government offered, there was a big strike, and the Greek government offered the cleaners to give permanent jobs in the public sector only to the Greek cleaners who were part of the union. And the Greek cleaners declined. They didn't accept that because they said half of our union is migrant cleaners. So if we accept now this kind of privilege, then all our struggles are gone wrong. And this was something that we also saw in the port of Genoa, which was very impressive for me when I went there, because the labor unions actually made concessions to their demands because they wanted to include in whatever labor rights were granted after the privatization. They wanted to include also new workers. So they accepted some concessions in order. So this kind of generality requires a different kind of spirit and a different kind of understanding of what labor is, And that's why I mentioned, I think the feminized and ethnicized aspects of Greek labor unionism are a big problem, because whenever we see that these are challenged, this is when we actually have a generality of labor, and we have, for me, this is the failure of the Greek labor unions right now. And I can see that this might change gradually, but it would require another generation, because right now we have this fragmentation that is so institutionalized that, and it's also not really challenged by the left-wing government. This is something that the left-wing government has propagated, although previously it was. So I think, in more general terms, that left-wing political parties in Europe, they lack a vision of how to deal with precarity. It's like, it's very simplistic, and I've seen that in Greece, I've seen that in other countries as well. Like, precarity is not something they can engage with. It's as if the only thing they can say is like, I wish we were not precarious. I wish we could all become like we were in the past. So this is my response. I hope it covers your question. And with regards to territorialization and deterritorialization, I think this is a complex concept, and in the paper we use it in the Deleuzian and Guattarian sense, which is quite complicated. It does not really refer to only to national sovereignty, but it refers also to it is considered in opposition to notions of space that are seamless, in a sense. So in Deleuze and Guattari, the processes of deterritorialization and territorialization are intertwined. And they don't have only to do with the state and sovereignty. They also have to do with the ways in which things are striated or they are seamless. So this is quite complex. But to go back to the question of the World Economic Forum and the centrality of the nation state, I think that in terms of the development of labor struggles in Piraeus, the nation state was very instrumental in promoting this kind of notion of investment as necessary to overcome the problems of the Greek economy. So in a sense, there was a moment there when let's say, deterritorialization met territorialization. It was as if the Greek state would regain its sovereignty if it became deterritorialized. So it's a very, I think it's a very paradoxical and complex situation which cannot be understood only in terms of, in Westphalian terms. Because really at this point, and this relates also to labor struggles and how it was very difficult for the Greek labor unions to actually connect for the Greek labor unions in the COSCO side to actually connect their struggles to other struggles, whether it is dock workers, the Global Dock Workers Association, for example, has a very ambivalent relations with the labor union in COSCO because they're very precarious. They don't have any of the rights that the OLP workers have. So they mainly connect to the OLP labor unions and not to the precarious workers unions. But at the same time, this is what we've been discussing with Brett, there has been a great difficulty in connecting the struggles of Greek precarious workers with the struggles of other precarious workers in Chinese run managed companies all over the world, and with labor struggles in China. There has been a disconnection which is like it sort of creates a gap in how we understand the transnational. I mean, it seems like the transnational is only at the level of management, only at the level of infrastructures, management of infrastructures, but we don't really understand how transnationalism can work at the level of labor. So it's sort of, I would say it's a complicated question. Yes.
Maybe I can ask a question on the basis of the discussion you just gave, and it's about the quote you put up from Alexis Tsipras, yes. Which says, maybe you can put it back up because it's quite interesting, but the way you read it during the paper implied, and I guess it's the most straightforward reading we could have of this particular quote, that the struggle of the Chinese people and the Greek people is to some extent the same struggle. But I think if we push this quote a little bit further in light of what you were saying, that you might be able to give us another reading. I'm noticing, for instance, that the first sentence describes a fight against, and the second sentence describes a fight for something. And the second sentence also describes a kind of fight for something that many leaders around the world say that their country is in this fight, even one whose circumstances in the crisis are very different from that of Greece. So what work is this statement really performing?
It's difficult to tell because this statement was actually made at the first period of Syriza, when they were trying to present an image that and they were actually I believe that they were trying to actually challenge European institutions. So I think that the statement does not go as far as to argue that we are under colonial rule right now, because there is a lot of, I mean, saying that in Greece, what you wrote in your book, that it is a post-colonial situation, is considered by many Greeks as as an insult. Like we were supposed to be the origin of Western civilization. What are you talking about? Like I had this very horrible experience with a colleague from South Africa who was in Greece, and we were giving we were doing a workshop in a Greek the Greek public sector, and she gave some examples from South Africa, and the public sector employees who were part of the workshop were really offended because they say, we are not South Africa, what are you talking about? So I think this statement is actually presenting this ambivalence of being in a condition where you are in debt, you're in a sovereign debt crisis, which is completely post-colonial in every sense. But you don't, like Tsipras didn't want to go as far as to say, you know, we are fighting in this way. But it's also, there is an ambivalence also with regard to China's role in all this, because obviously presenting China as a nation that fights against colonialism today is a bit of an overstatement, I think. It's very much based on historical understandings of China, which still resonate a lot with parts of the left. But it's as if we are trying to escape the present and be sort of part of the past. But I think that if this statement was also made in a way to address the Chinese press, because it's quite interesting that when this press conference was given, there was only one newspaper from Greece. It wasn't widely publicized in Greece. It was mostly Chinese newspapers that were involved. So it is a sort of statement that tries to combine all these different ambivalent notions. And I'm not sure if he would make the same statement today, that things with the European institutions have become much smoother and they have much better relations. I'm not sure if he would make the same statement. But what I think is also interesting is that I mean, the COSCO concession, and there is the other thing, that there is a concession of the Thessaloniki port to COSCO now as well. The COSCO concession does not seem to be in conflict with the processes of restructuring that were imposed by the European institutions. Actually, in texts published by European institutions on the progress of Greece, the COSCO concession is presented as a very positive development, as an investment that should be encouraged and further. So this is interesting in terms of, you know, what you described also, India, China relations that are always presented as an antagonism and very conflictual, whereas Europe-China relations also, I'm not sure how antagonistic they are in reality when it comes to investment in infrastructures. Yes.
Last quote in your panel, the quote from the Transnational Workers Union, workers' strike. Yeah, transnational social strike. So it's very interesting because I see sort of a dichotomy between the imaginary of efficiency and smoothness and then the reality of precarious labor. And then when I read the documents by organizations like AIIB or ADB, I also find the same dichotomy. They're talking about we have to reduce the noise. And I mean, it's sort of not exactly the same dichotomy, but it's a reworking of this dichotomy in a different language. Then logistical intervention will reduce the noise, and again it'll introduce this noise smoothness, or noise wrinkles, smoothness, wrinkles, noise, peace, etc. Now, when you talk about assemblages, and especially the works in the works of the Lujan Guattari and in the works of people who follow them like Michel Collin, we encounter constant blurring of exactly these dichotomies, that were this imaginary and the reality. And so when you sort of take that as a conceptual framework, how do you deal with these dichotomies that continuously are coming up? And this is important also because, I mean, I was thinking about, like, we know how to write about the past. We will narrativize the past. We know how to write about the future. We will speculate about the future. But how to write about the present? We can only describe the present, right? So how to write about precarity or precariousness, precariat? Everybody, including guys standing, insists on like we have to go for thick descriptions, etc. And even, I mean, that starts with Engels, I guess. But so when we're writing about the present, you have to go into this thick descriptions, where actually it's almost impossible to maintain sometimes this dichotomy between the real and the imaginary. Sometimes you don't know what is real and what is imaginary. So how will you write about that? I mean, this is sort of a like second part of the question. How do you write about the present when at the same time you have to think about the past and the future, and you have to sort of juggle all of these three time regimes at the same time?
We cannot really bifurcate what you take to be the imaginary and what you take to be what is happening as kind of, which can be separated very clearly. Very clearly. I mean, at one level, we can always say the imaginary of efficiency is a kind of display site of things that work in their own way. But on the other hand, things that work in their own way or things that keep on working in their own way includes the production of the imaginary itself. So kind of if we perch our inquiry on this division between what is the spectre and what is the reality, it will be beyond a point unfruitful line of inquiry, isn't it so? No, if that is the case, then when you say that in writing of the present, it obviously includes both the present that is producing this kind of phantasmagoria of what we call the likely or the desirable future, and things that work in their own way, things precisely that work in the way Nelli is showing. It includes both. So do we gain much by kind of, suggesting that there is a division of the two?
Please, I mean, can I have a second to... this is what I was trying to say, that when you are going for thick descriptions, you do not always make the distinction sometimes, especially in political leaflets, in political statements like this. But at the same time, you also need to have a distinction between these two to have a programmatic understanding, I guess. So, I mean, you have to deal with both. I mean, there is a tension. That's what I'm suggesting at.
I mean, these are very difficult philosophical questions, I have to say, to resolve here. But I think that the concept of desire is very central to the way in which I think we can deal with this question. Why? Because, of course, the present is the way in which we understand our present condition is determined by how we see our future and how we think of our past. But there is always a desire that desires always push us towards certain presents that we formulate in ways that we want to understand and that makes, let's say, make our present bearable. So I think that the way in which these kind of futuristic desires work is that they sort of make bearable precarity in everyday life, because they give you, they hide the fact that you are part of these labor relations that sort of prevent you from actually realizing your desire, from realizing the future that you imagine. But at the same time, because you have this future, this image in front of you, that something that you desire, you feel that you have to endure that in order to get this future, this futuristic. This is the sort of the weird thing about desire. Desire is always something motivating, but it never has to do with and usually hides the present problems and conditions. And to give you an example, and this is what I tried to say here, is that for us it was a big question once we entered the port, pretending to be journalists again, the COSCO port, is why the port was full of young, educated men. which young educated men are supposed to be the first who would find a job during the crisis, the economic crisis. Why did these men consider that they were worth these kinds of precarious jobs? This was a question that we were asking ourselves. And why isn't the port, since it has become so precarious, why the port doesn't have any migrants, doesn't have any women? Okay, and I think the way in which we try to explain that is, on the one hand, there is this threat of unemployability in Greece, that we are all scared that we'll be unemployed in the next day. And the second thing is, which is something that has to do with our fears of the present, and the second thing is that these kinds of futuristic scenarios work as a way for us to sort of hide the reality of our precariousness. And for these young men, and we weren't able to interview them because in COSCO we weren't allowed to interview them, but for the people overlooking COSCO, this was a central theme. The fact that this kind of futuristic scenarios would sort of take them out of their misery, of their problems, and they didn't even want to contemplate the fact that they will be so precarious, even when they enter this kind of desirable future. And I think this is the problem. I mean, this is the kind of problem with. In Marxist theory, we don't really have the concept of desire. This comes from psychoanalytical theory mostly, and that's why Guattari was the one who mostly used it. But I think it's a really useful concept in terms of labor and how labor becomes alienated. Okay, so, but this is like, it takes further discussion, of course, and it's a huge topic. Okay.
Speaking for an hour, I think we can bring her some relief and offer her a warm thank you, and offer a warm thank you to the organizers of this very stimulating event. I've certainly learnt a lot from the discussions, and I hope that you've learned something as well. So thank you, Nelli.